I'm Newt Gingrich, and I want to welcome you to spend some time with us tonight talking about two really interesting books that I'm very proud of. One by me and one by my wife, Callista. And in order to have a great discussion about these books, I want to introduce somebody I've been working with for 12 years now, Joe DeSantis. Joe's not normally the front guy. He is a great researcher, he's a great thinker. He does a lot of strategic consulting. But he has also helped with almost every one of my books over the last dozen years, and he has a really deep understanding of why Vengeance, as the third in a series that we're working on, really communicates important ideas. And somebody who's really studied what Callista's done with Ellis the Elephant in American history, he really understands the importance of Remember the Ladies as her seventh book in that series. And so let me introduce Joe and just say that I'm looking forward to this conversation. I'm very excited about Vengeance, and I think it's a remarkably timely book. But in addition, I'm very excited about the series that Callista's done with Ellis the Elephant, and I think Joe's actually going to introduce another guest that we have here who won't speak much tonight, but will be a very large presence during this book signing period.
Yeah, and in addition to helping with a lot of the books that you authored, I've also read a lot of these books to my kids, and they love them. They love the illustrations and the writing, the rhyming and stuff, and they learn a lot from them. So I think that as a package, this is really good. I want to say real quickly before we get to some questions that anyone who's watching can go to gingrichbooks.com and get an autographed copy of both Vengeance and Remember the Ladies. They'd be great for a gift, for yourself, anything. So it's gingrichbooks.com. So Vengeance is the third book in our trilogy about Brooke Grant, their political / terrorism thrillers. Remember the Ladies is, I believe, the seventh book in the series where Ellis the Elephant teaches children about American history. They seem very different, but you were a teacher in a past life, and everything that you and Callista have done with Gingrich Productions is based around teaching about America, teaching important lessons. So what is it that you want people to learn from these books?
Well, I think they really teach two very different things. I think that Remember the Ladies teaches about the president's wives, the history of America as seen through key spouses, starting with Martha Washington and coming up to the present. I think on the other hand, what Vengeance does is it takes today's headlines about terrorism and about North Korea, it blends them into an adventure story in which Brooke Grant, who is a who's a Marine officer, is deeply involved in trying to stop a terrible event. And I was telling one key figure on Capitol Hill today about Vengeance, and I'll elaborate on it in a minute. And his first reaction was, we shouldn't really give these kind of ideas to the terrorists. But I think people will find that Vengeance literally comes off the pages of today's newspaper headlines and helps you see both externally what the bad guys might be trying to do to us and what we have to do as a country in order to defend ourselves, working with our allies really around the world. So I'm very proud of Vengeance. It's the third in a series, as you pointed out, Joe. And I think that it gives you a really deep feeling about how dangerous the world is becoming in a way that literally does fit the daily headlines.
Yeah, we'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. Quickly, though, I think that first we need to address the elephant in the room. Literally.
And this is
the elephant in the room. That's Ellis. And I want to ask, Newt, you talked about it a little bit, but so why is learning about history important, and specifically the First Ladies? What window does that give you into America?
If I could hold this up just for a second so people know. This series, this is number 7, these are really designed, Callista and I talked about the fact that so many young Americans are not learning American history, and that if we could help parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles have something that was fun and exciting. I mean, as you said, when you read it to your children, and I've had a number of people tell me this, that they very often will want to hear, every couple of weeks they're going to say, read me this again. This one I think is important because, it's signed by Callista, And this one's important because it really carries the important role that our first ladies have had in the shaping of America. As I said, starting with Martha Washington, coming up to the present. And when you see different wives and the way in which they shape things, the importance of in Eleanor Roosevelt, for example, in dealing with, as somebody who really helped women's rights, and was a very, very active First Lady, I think it gives you a flavor of how important, or Nancy Reagan and her anti-drug program and her efforts to help young people. So I think this is, I like the whole series, but I thought Remember the Ladies was particularly important. Jackie Kennedy plays a significant role in here because she did so much to beautify and to create the modern White House as an extraordinary place. So I think people would find it fun. And the purpose of Ellis is to give young people somebody to identify with who's fun, who they can be interested in. It's more than just history in a dry sense, but it's actually learning history with the elephant and the things that the elephant did. And I've been very fortunate, and when I go out this fall on a book tour, I'll be by myself because Callista will be doing a job for the U.S. government. And so I'm very fortunate because I think Ellis is going to go with me on a number of occasions, and people who want to can both get a pretty exciting adult book in Vengeance, and they can get a great book for the young people in their lives that'll help them learn American history.
Well, that's gingrichbooks.com if anybody wants a signed copy of either of them. Newt will be signing Vengeance. Callista's signed Remember the Ladies. And real quick before we talk about Vengeance a little bit, I know Ellis would never play favorites, but who's your favorite First Lady?
Oh boy, I'll just get in lots of trouble if I.
Well, you got to pick someone who's already deceased because you can't insult anyone. That's a lot.
Well, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, for emotional reasons, Jackie Kennedy evoked the sense of being a First Lady. I knew Nancy Reagan personally, and I thought she was a remarkable person. So I'd hate to have to choose between the two of them, but each of them brought a sense of grace and a sense of class to the White House. Jackie Kennedy really modernizes it and invests in it. Nancy Reagan brought a sort of the glamour of Hollywood and the sense of what the Hollywood world was like. And both of them, I think, were people that America could really identify with, be proud of, and think that's, that's what a First Lady ought to be like.
Mm-hmm. So with Vengeance, it was interesting. I remember your speech at the Republican National Convention in 2016. And I know this was also around the time that you, Pete Early, and me were working on Vengeance. And in the speech, there's this really startling moment where you just run through all the different terrorist attacks by Islamic terrorists that had occurred in the last 44 days. And he just listed going on, and it goes on for like 2 minutes. It was jarring to hear them all together, but it was also interesting was your next line, where you said that because they were mostly gun and knife and truck attacks. And as bad as those were, you said, that isn't even the worst of it. It's not even 9/11. The danger that we face, the one that is existential, is a nuclear weapon going off in an American city, and that would permanently alter the United States. Vengeance, without giving too much away, involves a nuclear weapon in the hands of a terrorist. So what is it that you want people to understand?
I love the cover of Vengeance because it has the Washington Monument right in the center of it. And it's a reminder this can all disappear, which I really worry about every single day. The original, by the way, it's just to show you how we blend fiction to make it exciting with facts to make it based in reality. The original warning that the greatest threat was a weapon of mass destruction going off in an American city, probably by a terrorist group, actually came from the Hart-Rudman Commission, which President Clinton and I created, and which spent 3 years looking at American national security, and in March of 2001 warned precisely what Vengeance is about. that there's a grave danger that at some point a terrorist group is going to acquire some kind of nuclear capability, and that would be horrifying and would change America permanently. Think about how we reacted to 3,100 dead Americans on 9/11. Now add 2 zeros, and you begin to sense at 300 or 400,000 what the effect would be. Think about what you've seen in Puerto Rico, in Florida, in Houston, and Louisiana in the last few weeks. Now imagine that it happened in 1 second, shattered a city, created a nuclear zone that had radiation, and created a huge number of people who were wounded, literally in 1 second. And we currently couldn't cope with it. And so Vengeance is both a serious book about public policy and a novel that shows you a group of people. I'm like, Joe, I don't want to give too much of the plot away, but this is a novel that shows an international effort led by an American to try to stop terrorists, who I think it's fair to say the one key plot line that I'm going to talk about over and over again because it's so much in the headlines. These are terrorists who we had earlier described in Duplicity and in Treason, which are the first 2 books in our series. And these are terrorists who find a way to trade 2 super tankers full of oil to North Korea for some nuclear material. Now, I believe that's actually very real, but in the novel, it sets the stage for a horrifying race against time to save American cities.
And you know, North Korea, it was interesting that North Korea came up in the news again, right in advance of this coming out, because it's not something that we were anticipating, but just going to happen. But you made a recent point addressing, why doesn't China get tougher with sanctions? And you said, I think on Fox, and you said, well, are we sure we want to do that? That might actually make North Korea desperate, and then that's the type of scenario you're talking about. If they're really, really hard up for oil, what would they be willing to trade for it?
Exactly.
That's the thing.
I mean, I remember as early as about 2001 looking at North Korean television coverage of Iranians visiting the North Korean missile factories. Now, this is all public material because the North Koreans were very pleased that somebody would come and buy missiles from them. And I think they sold 19 missiles to the Iranians. The North Koreans tried to build a nuclear facility in Syria, and the Israelis bombed it in 2008. And there's no question in retrospect, this was a North Korean facility being built in Syria, probably paid for with Iranian oil money. So this notion of the North Koreans being willing to commercialize their capability, I think, is not something small. And again, I mean, I am really proud of Vengeance. I think Vengeance is as powerful and as effective as a way of understanding the world as any nonfiction book I've read in recent years. I think if you relax and you pick up the rhythm of the story, what you'll find at the end as one person said to me about our last novel, they stayed up all night reading and didn't realize they were doing it till they got done. So if you really get into this, and Brooke Grant, I think, is a very compelling, very charismatic figure who, as a Marine major, is very courageous, and she is leading the effort at the request of the president to try to figure out what's going on and to try to stop it before the terrorists can use their North Korean material in order to try to take out an American city.
Well, that's gingrichbooks.com if anyone wants to get an autographed copy of either Vengeance or Remember the Ladies. Real quick, before we talk about First Ladies again, you talked about a nuclear weapon, the danger of just permanently altering the U.S. One of the things we do in Vengeance and in this entire series is that we invent different characters to play different points of view. And it's not always obvious. I think we were always kind of conscious. We didn't want to make it seem too lopsided. Like, we weren't necessarily giving away your point of view.
Right.
All right, with who has it. We tried to actually accurately, display the pros and cons, have both sides have their best arguments. One of the things that is wrestled with in the entire thing is the balance between civil liberties and actually allowing our intelligence communities to do what it takes to prevent a nuclear attack, something horrible from happening. Can you talk a little bit more about that and just the conversation we've had nationally since 9/11 about where the appropriate balance lies?
Well, I think it's always a very big challenge. When the world gets more dangerous, there's a tendency for the government to become more aggressive in monitoring things and in monitoring people. And at the same time, you have to worry about the government itself becoming a problem. So there's always this level of tension. But part of the reason I felt very strongly in working with Pete Early, who's just a remarkably talented person and brings very unique insights and background, former Washington Post reporter, and it's probably part of the reason that we're able to create in Vengeance a novel that literally comes off the front pages of the newspaper. Part of it was we wanted to get across this question. If you knew that there was the danger of losing a city, then how aggressive would you be trying to stop the bad guys from getting there? And I think we capture in Vengeance the real tension. You know, you probably don't read Miranda rights to terrorists on a ship, for example. You just shoot them because you're afraid they're going to blow up the ship with you on it. And so you really get into this kind of action sequence. And I think anybody who is interested both in the action of special forces and the real threat of nuclear weapons and the politics of Washington all blended into one book will find this to be a pretty compelling book.
You mentioned your collaboration with Pete Early on in this book. We received a question from the people watching. They want to know if you and Callista will ever collaborate on a book.
Oh boy. Well, like to be honest, now that I think about it, we have a wonderful book called Rediscovering God in America, where Callista provided a remarkable range of pictures, and then we worked together on the text. And Rediscovering God in America is a walking tour of Washington that relates each of the key figures in Washington. If you go to the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, it relates each of them in their own unique chapter back to God's role in their lives and God's role in America. So in that sense, Callista and I have collaborated. As you know, Joe, we've also collaborated on 9 movies, the most recent of which was The First American about George Washington. And so we do a lot of things, but I will confess, while like you, I have read Remember the Ladies a number of times because I always tell people this is interesting. I think our audience will find this interesting. This is a novel. This is a children's book designed for 4 to 8-year-olds, which has to rhyme, and it has to be factually accurate. It takes Callista about as long. Let me just show you an example. So you take a particular page. This spread takes her about as long to write as one of my chapters. And the reason is there are limited words. They have to rhyme. The rhythm has to be correct. The words have to be accurate. And so everybody at Gingrich Productions, sooner or later, has read and reread all of these because she's a perfectionist. I'm not a perfectionist, but she's a perfectionist. She'll get it almost right. And then she'll come back the next day and say, you know, I don't think that page is quite right yet. And then people will walk around all day reading it out loud, trying to get it right. So it's a very interesting, very different process between the Ellis the Elephant series, which has on the one hand a really large character in Ellis, and on the other hand this very detailed, trying to think through. I remember one time I suggested a particular scene and she said to me, this is for 4 to 8 years old.
It's a battle scene?
Yeah. She said, we're not doing that for 4 to 8 years old. And she was right.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the time of it. Then you also have to factor in the time that the artist, Susan Arciero, spends working on the pictures, which are really compelling and really great as well.
Yeah.
So ask a couple questions that have come in. Some of them, of course, have to do with politics. They want to know, John from Imperial, California, wants to know, when is the swamp going to be drained and the socialist left prosecuted? And speaking of prosecution, just to get Christine from West Blockton, Alabama, specifically wants to know when Hillary is going to be prosecuted.
I'm not sure Hillary will ever be prosecuted because the Clintons are so surrounded by lawyers and so surrounded by money and power that it's a very daunting mountain to climb. I think where pieces of the swamp that are being drained, I think if you look at the judges that President Trump is appointing, they are clearly moving the court system towards a more constitutional, more conservative baseline. If you look at the deregulation, I went down to the White House the other day for a deregulation event. There were 20,000 pages of government regulations in 1960. There are 200,000 pages now. Trump, by the end of 2018, may be the first time in history that there are fewer pages of regulation than when he came in.
Mm-hmm.
They're actually repealing them faster than they're passing new ones. I think the current rate is 16-1, that they are actually repealing all these regulations. And so there are pieces of the swamp starting to be drained. I think that I'm carrying around, this is the Paul Ryan postcard tax form, which I carry around to remind people. If they do pass the tax reform bill, about 95% of all Americans will be able to pay their taxes by just filling this out. No tax, you won't have to pay some tax writer, you won't have to pay a CPA, you won't have to pay a tax lawyer. So those are things where I think they're starting to make progress. But I always remind people, when you, if you set out to drain the swamp, the alligators will be unhappy. And a lot of what you see in the noise of Washington is the alligators biting back. And a large number of the alligators are actually the news media. So, you know, they're watching the swamp starting to drain and they're going, this is terrible, where will I hide?
Speaking of tax reform, some people wanted to know if Republicans will ever be able to unite on anything.
I think they're going to. I did a Facebook Live today with Speaker Paul Ryan. So he had a two-speaker Facebook event, and I think that they actually are on track. The White House, the House, and the Senate Republicans are on track to actually get the tax bill done, maybe as early as Thanksgiving, and they're very serious about it. And they know that it's sort of life and death. They have got to deliver on cutting taxes. And frankly, I thought Paul Ryan did a great job today of explaining it. If, for example, and because this was a little confused the way people first reported it. If you're in the 10% bracket right now, they are doubling your deduction, which actually means virtually everybody in the 10% bracket will pay zero. Now, the new bracket is 12%. So the news media promptly thought, oh, this means you're going from 10 to 12. No. The people at 10 are going to zero. The people who are going to 12 are currently at 15. Yeah. So you look at this stuff and you begin to realize, you know, it's really interesting, both how much the news media tries to avoid covering things, and also the amount of detailed work that has to go into this scale of a tax bill.
Yeah, well, in addition to the math and the policy of it, it's thinking through how are we going to describe this in a way that prevents the news media from finding the least opportunistic.
And candidly, that's why I love the Paul Ryan postcard, because this is vivid. I can be on Fox and pull this out, and it's obvious. Now, somebody did say, however, it's oversized and therefore will take extra postage. I want to be fair here.
But you just smaller print.
Small. No, they can't get much smaller.
You know, you can just get rid of the banner up top.
That's true.
That might be true. Well, so it's gingrichbooks.com if anybody wants to purchase a signed copy of either Vengeance or Remember the Ladies. They are they make great gifts. They're great for yourself. It's a great collector's items. gingrichbooks.com. In Vengeance, we talk about you see an odd collaboration between countries. You made a slight hint of it earlier when you talked about Iran and North Korea. But there's also two characters working with Brooke Grant. One is a Mossad agent, and one is an agent from Saudi intelligence. And I remember when we were conceptualizing this and figuring out the plot points with Pete Early, you actually suggested that. You said, you know what, we need to have them working together because in this new world, you're starting to see some cooperation between them. Can you explain that insight that you had a little bit more and what's going on that is sort of changing the balance and the alliances in the Middle East?
Okay, before I do, let me just say to everybody, I'm also signing Callista's books.
Okay.
So, and this is a unique opportunity for people who would like to get her Ellis the Elephant book signed by both of us. I'm also signing her books. What happened was, I pay a lot of attention to the Middle East. I've been studying developments there since the early 1970s. Excuse me, I visited across the whole region. And you can tell that the fear of Iran is driving the Saudis and the Israelis together. And so you today have, I mean, none of this is public, none of this is in the local newspaper because the Saudis are really afraid of what the radicals would do. But the truth is, the intelligence community across the region is now collaborating. Now, what I didn't realize when we sat down together and began laying this plot out was that you'd have Donald Trump go to Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, and have 57 different Sunni countries showing up, have the Saudis signing $400 billion in contracts for American goods, and have the kind of overt relation. And for the first time in history, an American president left Riyadh and flew directly to Israel. Never happened before. And I think in that sense, when we were writing Vengeance, we were forecasting the level of collaboration, because if you imagine, look, if the North Koreans did, as we suggest in here, if they did sell or swap nuclear material for super tankers full of oil, and people realized you don't know where that nuclear material is going. It could go to the Persian Gulf, it could go to Israel, it could go to the United States, it could go to Europe. Everybody would have a vested interest in trying to track it down and stop it. And so we stipulated, as we thought this through, that we're right at the edge of a period where you're going to see very unusual alliances that you wouldn't have thought 15 years ago were possible. And we see some of that developing. We see the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the United Arab Emirates, the Saudis, all collaborating in quiet, private ways with the Israelis, trying to cut off the flow of weapons, trying to undermine Iran. So it would not be abnormal to suddenly have folks showing up who represent the interests of stopping a nuclear weapon from going off. And I think that that's a very important thing to be aware of. And I should just tell people watching, no, the lights are about to come back on. It's one of the things that happens in our building.
It's fine.
It happens in our building every night at this time.
Yeah.
And we've learned how to push a button and put it back on.
We've had a couple of people ask questions. You know, obviously, Remember the Ladies is for children 4 to 8 years old, and you know, specifically the parents to buy to read to them. Some people want to know, how do you? Politics is so nasty and negative right now. How do you talk to your children about politics in a way that is not going to poison it for them, or is not going to make them overly cynical, or is not, I just, weird example, my son who's in kindergarten last year during the election came home and asked me just randomly at dinner, is Donald Trump a bad man? Aside from the hilarity of him calling him Donald Trumpet, but I was just, where did he pick that up? Hopefully it wasn't from his teacher, but he obviously he got it from some kindergartner, he was talking to. How do you talk to your children about the importance of being active and being engaged in citizenship without bleeding into all the negativity and nastiness that we see.
Well, I think one of the things that Callista works on, and when we talk about thinking through her Ellis the Elephant series, she wants it to be positive. She wants people to understand the richness of American history, that on the one hand there are Republican first ladies, Nancy Reagan would be a classic example. On the other hand, there are Democratic first ladies. Lady Bird Johnson would be an example. And so she reaches out and does research, and she tries to find very specific positive things. So every single page of Remember the Ladies and of the preceding 6 books, all of them are positive about America. Mm-hmm. And I think her feeling is that teaching patriotism, teaching people to love the United States, is something we're not doing enough of in school, and that she's trying to contribute to that. So in a sense, she's trying to strengthen our sense of citizenship. I'm trying to strengthen our understanding of how dangerous the world is, and that we as a country have to be prepared to do what it takes to defend ourselves and protect ourselves. Mm-hmm. And in the sense, the 2 books you wouldn't normally think this, but the 2 books in a sense are actually trying to move in the same direction towards a stronger, healthier, more survivable America.
In Vengeance, there are characters that are debating whether or not to use the term radical Islamic terrorism, much like happened in the past election and over the past couple of years. In your opinion, is this semantics? How important is that issue?
Well, I think it's important in the sense that you cannot explain the emotional power of the terrorist without understanding the religious base that motivates them. These are not just average nutcakes. These are not just people who had a bad weekend. These are people who genuinely come to believe that their spiritual life will lead them to a better future, and that they are willing to die for God. Mm-hmm. And part of the power of their recruiting, much of which is done on the internet, and they are recruiting Americans, they're recruiting British, they're recruiting French, Belgians. A lot of the power of that recruiting is that they're offering a spiritual vision of the world to replace the vacuum that much of the modern state leaves people with. So in a sense, if the opioid crisis is a response to a sense of despair, so is conversion to radical Islam, and a sense of I want to invest my life, I'm willing to die for God. And to try to explain the Islamist movement without explaining that its derivation is authentically, deeply, powerfully religious, I think makes it impossible to figure out a strategy to defeat it. Mm-hmm. Because it has a motivation that transcends normal politics.
Do you think that in Duplicity, there's a scene where one of the characters describes Islamic supremacism or radical Islamism as almost like a virus, and to stop thinking about it as, oh, we're going to attack this network and we're going to shut them down, we're going to cut off their money. ISIS, we're eroding ISIS. They've been the amount of land they control is steadily shrinking. It's getting smaller and smaller. But in a way, their caliphate is online now. It's where they do their training. It's where they do their recruiting. How do we deal with that? And in Vengeance, is there is part of the plot line in that? How do we, without again giving too much away, is part of it to sort of discuss that problem?
Well, Vengeance is dealing with 3 very different problems. It's dealing, first of all, with an immediate crisis. There are bad guys who may have nuclear material that could take out an American city. Mm-hmm. That requires you to focus in a laser-like way on how do we find them, how do we stop them, because it's so horrifying. Second, there is this challenge of dealing with a movement which is spreading invisibly through the internet and gradually spreading across the planet. And third, there's the challenge of the American political system. This is a book, all 3 of these volumes have a great deal of politics and intelligence community, the Congress, the presidency. In fact, the first one starts with the presidential campaign. So I try to weave in what I've learned over the years, both about politics and about Congress and about government. But in addition, 2 women were killed in Marseille 2 nights ago by somebody yelling Allahu Akbar. The French have said that was a terrorist attack. There was probably almost no way to imagine that this person was going to do that. Mm-hmm. And you have this continuous erosion, day after day, week after week, of things happening where you have to ask yourself, how is it spreading? How do we defeat something which is almost invisible, if you will? Mm-hmm. And I think it's I think it's one of the great challenges of the next 30 years, because if we can't find a method of defeating it, it's going to keep growing and keep spreading. And you're exactly right. We are currently going after it very hard in the Syria-Iraq region in its ISIS form. But more people are actually killed in Nigeria by Boko Haram, which is a variation on Islamic supremacism, than are killed by ISIS. And so as you go around the world, you discover a variety of places where there's some pretty bad people. I mean, there's a huge fight underway in the southern Philippines, mm-hmm. where the government has been fighting to regain control of a medium-sized town that the Islamists have taken over.
And that's so interesting. I mean, the coverage of the Las Vegas attack, that was something that I was unaware of until they mentioned that the shooter's girlfriend was from the Philippines and that they were worried about this possible ISIS connection there. And I said, the Philippines? What are you even talking about? And then that came out. It's alarming the many different places this is popping up. And it shows it's a bit like whack-a-mole, throughout the entire planet.
And part of it, of course, is legitimately that Islam has been a very, very successful religion. The southern Philippines are naturally Muslim. Mm-hmm. The northern 2/3 of the Philippines are deeply Catholic. Mm-hmm. So there's a fault line that runs right through there.
Right.
You have a similar fault line in Indonesia. You have a fault line in Thailand. Parts of southern Thailand have a very strong Muslim population. But what is more sobering, I mean, you can sort of say, okay, somebody who's unhappy in southern Thailand decided to join a radical cell. What's startling to me is when you start finding people who are American, British, as Tony Blair said after the bombings in 1996 in the British subway, all 4 of the people involved in the bombing were born in Great Britain, grew up in public housing, went to public school, and had jobs.
NIH, right?
And then they were the National Health. The National Health Service.
Yeah.
And then they decided that they would rather blow things up. Mm-hmm. And I think for Blair, it was a wake-up call for how bad and how hard this is going to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to lighten things up for a second. By the way, it's gingrichbooks.com if anybody wants to purchase a signed copy of Vengeance or Remember the Ladies. Newt will be signing Vengeance, and both Newt and Callista are signing Remember the Ladies. This is a little game called 22 Questions in 2 Minutes.
Okay.
All right. So does anyone timing us? Yeah. Okay. All right. I don't want to break the rules. You ready?
I guess this is totally new to me.
Okay. Who inspires you most?
A guy named Paul Walker.
Who would you like to trade places with if you could?
No one.
Who makes you laugh the most?
My wife.
Who's the last person you called/texted?
I called or texted Randy Evans.
Randy Evans.
He will love being named.
All right. Who's your favorite filmmaker or director?
John Ford.
What's the last book you read?
The Battle of Britain.
What one thing do you need to have in your fridge at all times?
Yogurt.
What is your favorite pastime?
Watching football.
What is your dream car?
1955 Mercedes Goldwing aluminum body, 300 SL.
Wow. What is your secret snack?
Yogurt.
Where do you see yourself in 10 years?
Probably bouncing around the planet, having a great time, writing books and giving speeches and hanging out with Callista.
Same thing you're doing now.
Basically the same thing. Yeah. I actually have a very boring life. I just do. It's like Groundhog Day.
What item would you love to get your hands on if it went up for auction?
1955 Gullwing 300 SL Mercedes. But I'd also like to get like a dinosaur.
A dinosaur.
Yeah.
Fossil. I assume.
Fossil dinosaur.
Okay. All right.
I mean, if they auctioned a real one, that'd be cool too. But I don't think they're gonna auction one.
Well, you know, the genetics stuff is pretty amazing. What is your biggest pet peeve?
My weight.
What is your favorite fruit?
Peaches.
Good Georgia answer. What was the last movie you saw in theaters?
That's what I saw in theaters. It was Tom Cruise's, I think, Mission Impossible 3.
What color is your toothbrush?
Currently purple because Calista just swapped my toothbrushes. Every couple of weeks she comes by and steals my old toothbrush and puts a new one down.
Do you have any hidden talents?
No.
Are you a morning person or a night owl?
Whatever I have to be.
What cause is dear to your heart?
What cause?
Yeah.
Oh, I think saving wildlife.
What is the last gift that you gave and the last one you received?
Oh boy, that's a good question. Well, it's sort of cheating. The last gift I gave, I actually just signed a while ago to my next door neighbor a copy of Vengeance. That was sort
Good
of
answer.
an easy one.
Yeah.
Let's see, the last one that I received, I got a coin from an army officer the other day.
Oh,
Yeah,
cool. Where do you want to go that you've never been?
Borneo to see orangutans.
How do you take your coffee?
Black, although currently I am going crazy about the what do you call it? The cold.
Cold brew.
There's a cold brew vanilla that's 110 calories that you can get at Starbucks. That's really good.
Have you tried the nitro brew?
No, that would be too much caffeine. I mean, you guys couldn't stand being around me if I drank the nitro brew. I have to have some regard for my coworkers here.
Right. A couple of more questions from people
How close do we
watching.
come? How long did that take?
Oh, you're fine.
Okay. Gingrichbooks.com if you want to purchase a signed copy of Vengeance or Remember the Ladies. A couple more questions coming in. What was your favorite book growing up?
Probably either The Jungle Book by Kipling or Frank Buck's Bring 'Em Back Alive.
Do you ever face writer's block, and what do you do to overcome it?
Go to sleep.
What's a book you could read over and over?
Oh, there are a bunch of them I read over and over. I'm just right now rereading Asimov's Foundation series, which is 3 volumes that he wrote when he was very young. And the first one was published in 1951, and it has a pocket communicator. I mean, this guy had envisioned the future at levels. He's the person who invents the rules of robotics.
Mm-hmm.
And Asimov's a genius.
Yeah.
So I could reread Asimov. But I also read, like, Michael Connelly is an extraordinary novelist. Daniel Silva, I reread all, I think, 18 volumes. I've now read twice of his
Mhm.
books about an Israeli spy. So I get into these waves where I just immerse myself.
Do you have any advice to aspiring authors?
The same one that Hemingway gave. Hemingway was once asked to write 1,000 words on how to become an author. And he said the key to becoming an author is, and then put the word write 990 sometimes.
You just start writing and then edit
Start
later?
writing. I thought, yeah, just start writing. Learn, write about what you know. Actually, years ago, when we lived in France, I ran across a book called The King of Paris, which was a novel about the life of Alexandre Dumas, who was the second most popular novelist in France in the 19th century. He wrote The Three Musketeers, The Count of Monte Cristo, etc.
Mhm.
And there's a line in there when he's a very young man where somebody says to him, live your life until it's full, and then you'll be able to write the overflow. And I always thought there was a lot to, I mean, and let me just give you an example for folks. You know, vengeance comes out of the fact that I'm the longest serving teacher in the senior military, over 25 years. I served in the Congress for 20 years. As Speaker, I was on the group of 8 which were given all the major intelligence secrets. I've run for president, I've advised presidents. So when you go through this, while it's a novel, it's pretty deeply rooted in reality. And so I think that's part of what they meant about, live your life to the full and then start writing it.
Speaking of one of the things that you talked about the Hart-Rudman Commission and the work you've been doing in the past decades looking at the danger of terrorism, even going back before 9/11. Port security is dealt with in this book. Can you describe a little bit about how challenging this is? And
Yeah, when I was on the Defense Policy Board shortly after 9/11, we got into this at length, and I've talked to people from the Coast Guard about it over the years. Port security is a nightmare. I was just getting a briefing last week. There are something like 200,000 containers a week that leave China, and there are 4 people inspecting them. So one of the fears has always been, if you don't inspect something until it gets to Long Beach, and it's a nuclear weapon, it's too late.
Yep.
And so we've developed some technologies to go and look for radiation, but if you mask it so the radiation doesn't show up much, you have a real nightmare. And so the whole question of, and this of course is why you have, for example, people who are smuggled into the United States on ships. I mean, we've had occasions when a ship has shown up and 3 or 4 of the containers are filled with human beings, some of whom died of deprivation or of heat or of exhaustion on the way over. So I think it's easy to underestimate how big a problem port security is. And one of the things I was surprised by when I first started looking at this is the oceans are so big, and ships are, there are vastly more ships than there are airplanes. So the idea we have that you can track every airplane in the U.S., that's true, there's a limited number. You start getting out in the middle of the ocean and you've got some ship that was built 50 years ago in a Greek shipyard owned by a Liberian flagged company based in Panama, which is actually owned by a Russian who recently has leased it to somebody from Cyprus. You have no idea what's going on.
Yep.
And it makes the oceans one of the great frontiers that are really challenging and really tricky.
And one of the key plot points in this book is the challenge of trying to find a boat.
That's right.
Out there. So we're almost out of time. Let's going back to remember the ladies for a second. What I want to ask a broad question. Why is it important to know history, to study history?
I think there are 3 reasons it's important to know history, and part of the reason I became a historian. The first is you have to know who you are. If I say, well, you're an American, you have no idea what American, I mean, one of the great virtues of Callista's books is, if you start reading these to kids when they're 4 or 5 years old, her 7 books are a really good initial introduction to being an American. So when we say, and this is when you get into things like the NFL argument and whether or not the flag matters, whether or not the national anthem matters, so part of it's your own identity. The second reason it's important to know history is because there are absolute lessons that you learn. So you learn, why did Churchill know that Hitler was a huge threat and no other major politician in Great Britain did? And you learn lessons about thinking about the world, and it stretches your mind. The third reason I think for studying history is it's about the world you live in. So, I said I want to go to Borneo. Well, it helps to know the map well enough to know where Borneo is. I think it's really important to be aware of Gettysburg and the Civil War. Well, if you have no idea what the Civil War was about, you have no idea that there was a battle at Gettysburg, and you have no idea where Gettysburg is, your mental landscape shrinks so that you're down to being able to text your friends and listen to music, but you don't know anything.
Yeah.
And that limits the potential. It limits your ability to have an imagination because you don't have any fuel for the imagination. Can we have Ellis come back in for a minute? Because I just think people need to realize that Ellis has been an enormous help. I want people to see you and realize it. Ellis did a really great job. I think you're more impressive in person, actually. But we don't rent him out, so you can't have him. But I think Ellis does a great job of having young people pay attention to these books. And Ellis has a friend who's a bird, an eagle. And on every page, you can find the eagle. If you watch 4 or 5-year-olds looking for the eagle.
That's absolutely true.
Right?
Yeah. The kids always wanted
it's
to
just
find
a
the eagle.
piece of, Callista put together what is really, with Susan Arciero's wonderful drawings, is really a great series. And Ellis has been the living embodiment. The young kids have 2 reactions. We go to a book signing together, and I think we're going to be doing some starting next week. About a third of the kids take one look at Ellis and run away screaming because he's too big and they're too short. The other 2/3 run up and hug him or grab his trunk. And it's just great fun. It's fun to watch and see who's going to do what. But Ellis is always willing to get pictures with kids, and he'll be with me at several bookstores next week doing signings.
And but you can go to gingrichproductions.com to get a list of the book signings that we're going to be doing. And of course, go to gingrichbooks.com to get a signed copy of Vengeance or of Remember the Ladies. We have, I think, a couple more minutes. Is there anything else that you would want to add about why you think Vengeance or Remember the Ladies are particularly important to
Well, I think they're very different. I mean, first of all, I'd say to everybody who's watching, if you have young people who are in the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old age group, all of the books in Callista's Alice the Elephant series are really helpful to them. You'll find they like listening to them. The rhythm of them is really powerful. They get into the books, and over time they learn a lot, and it sets a stage for them the rest of their lives to know more and more about American history. I think in the case of Vengeance, you're going to find, first of all, it's fun as a novel. I mean, this is an adventure story. It is a political story. It's a terrorism story. It's a nuclear threat story, all wrapped into one. And from the time it starts, it never slows down. So I think people will find it's a great way to be both entertained and educated about some realities that you see on page 1 that are real. That the threat of North Korea is real. The threat of terrorists is real. The possibility that terrorists will collaborate with North Korea is real. And so I think in that sense, Vengeance is sort of a fast-paced, fictional introduction to a world which is unfortunately real and worth knowing about.
Well, gingrichbooks.com to get a signed copy of either Vengeance or Remember the Ladies. Thank you for everyone joining. Thank you, Newt, for
great fun, Joe. Thank you.
Yeah,
this is your first time to be the host of this kind of operation.
That's true. It's true. I did a little TV on the campaign, but that was only if there was no one else available. It's not really my thing. But you know, the book Vengeance and Remember the Ladies, their official release date is Tuesday. This upcoming Tuesday. Yeah. What day is that? The 13th. It's the 11th. It's October 11th. That's when it'll be available in stores.
Oh, I want to commend you for the questions. That was I had no idea you were going to do that. That was a very clever additional piece of the game here.
Is it the 10th? Okay.
They're
the
working
release
on
date
dates
is October 10th.
They're coming down.
All right, Tuesday, October 10th, and that's when it'll be available in stores. But of course, you can order a signed copy right now at gingrichbooks.com. So
thank you, and thank you all for spending time with us this evening.
Yeah.